Well, welcome to McNack's Kitchen, where we have just enjoyed a really good piece of flank steak that we marinated with lime juice and orange juice and manuka honey and garlic, and some other things, but that'll come on the website soon as far as the recipe. But as we were eating, my 10-year-old asked me why I cut it the way I cut it, why I cut it sideways. And there's two parts to the whole sideways thing. And I thought if she wanted to know, that you might want to know. So I guess one of the things is that you probably hear people say, cut against the grain. And on a piece of meat like a flank steak, that couldn't be any more critical, because flank steak is not the most tender piece of meat that you'll ever eat. However, if you cut it properly, it will be way more tender. If you marinate it properly and cook it properly, even be more tender. But cutting it is probably the most critical way of making sure that this meat is as tender as possible. So if you can look at this piece of meat, you can kind of see the grains of the muscle going in this direction. And so what it means when it says cut against the grain means not with the grain, right? So if this is the grain of the meat, this would be with the grain, because then I'm cutting the entire grain of that muscle together, and when I do that, I'm not helping break down that piece of muscle. So if I turn it sideways now, so the grain is going this way, now I'm going to cut on the side here, and that is against the grain. It's not partially against the grain on this meat, it's completely against the grain. Sometimes people kind of do it as an angle. In this cut of meat on a flank steak, and other pieces of kind of meat that's not as that tender, cutting it completely against the grain is important. The other part that my daughter was asking about was what you call cutting it on a bias. So you can cut it straight up and down, and that's fine. But if you cut it at an angle like this, it doesn't really help a whole lot with the meat being more tender, although it probably does slightly. What it's really for is to make it pretty. So when we cut this meat, we cut it kind of on an angle at the bias against the grain. Take our time. Then it's really just kind of a really pretty piece of meat when you're done. Again, this meat, because of its lack of general tenderness, you want to cut it pretty thin, and you want to cut it kind of thinly across the meat and against the grain. I gave my daughter a piece cut both ways and asked her to chew both and tell me which one was more tender, and hands down, cutting it this way was way more tender than cutting it with the grain. So that's it. I hope that answers any questions you might have had about what it means to cut against the grain, and I hope you enjoy this recipe when we put it on the website.